So good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I'm Karen Taylor. I'm the Program Director. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Labor, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series, of which, of course, tonight's lecture is part of. The Labor, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I also want to thank New York Landmarks Conservancy for partnering in promoting tonight's event, and also to remind you that there will be a short wine and cheese reception after tonight's lecture, which we hope you will stay for. For those of you who are perhaps less familiar with the General Society, a very brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by 22 skilled craftsmen. Today, this 229, in fact 230, I beg your pardon, it's now 230 years old, organization continues to serve and improve the quality and life of the people of the City of New York. And this is through its educational, philanthropic, and cultural programs. These include its tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, and its nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of course, of which tonight's lecture is part of. You will find an informational postcard on your seat that provides background information, and you will also find library membership on the front table, in addition to information on our other lectures. This is the second in a series of 4 landmark lectures, and upcoming topics include the 50th anniversary of the historic New York City Landmark Law, which will take place on April 21st with Peg Breen, President of the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and a program, the final program in May, on the architecture of cross and cross. We have been so fortunate to have a really fantastic curator for this series, and that is Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. And Lisa is here to not only as a curator, but she's also going to introduce tonight's speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Lisa Easton.
Thank you, Karen. I'm honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen's 2015 Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. I just said to Amanda, that's such a tongue twister. I have to write it down in order to read it right every time I see it. When asked to curate the 4-part Landmark series, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals whose experience captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology of materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I'm honored to present my colleague, Miss Amanda Trienens, who is the owner and principal conservator at Cultural Heritage Conservation LLC. Ms. Trienens has developed her expertise in the field of architectural conservation, working on a variety of cultural heritage sites and nationally significant landmark structures. Ms. Trienens received her Master's of Science in Historic Preservation and Advanced Certificate in Architectural Conservation from the University of Pennsylvania. She previously held the position of Senior Conservation and Managing Director of the prestigious firm Integrated Conservation Resources, also known in the profession as ICR. Prior to establishing her own firm, affording her the opportunity to work on architecturally and culturally significant buildings here in New York City, including the restoration of the Solomon Guggenheim Museum and the Aero-Saarinen-designed TWA Terminal at JFK Airport. Ms. Trienens is a member of the American Institute of Conservation, the Association for Preservation Technology International, and the International Institute for Conservation. Tonight, Amanda will be discussing conservation goals and methodologies for landmarks. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Ms. Amanda Trienens.
Good evening. I'm sort of here with a headphone and a microphone, so hopefully I can figure this out. Thank you, Lisa and Karen and the General Society, for asking me to present tonight. It's an honor to talk with you tonight. I spoke with Lisa about presenting, and she said actually the audience was quite diverse, so I thought it might be a good opportunity to introduce architecture conservation, some of who we are, what we do, why, and how. And I hope if there are any conservators out there, there's maybe not so much new information, but I hope you find something new tonight. So just a very brief history on modern conservation theory. It came out of an anti-restoration sentiment, spearheaded particularly by John Ruskin in England in the mid-1800s. This was in response to some of his contemporaries at the time, restoration architects, most notably Viollet-le-Duc in France, who had sort of this loose interpretation of restoration and how to execute it. So Ruskin had quite a vehement reaction to some of the work he saw going on at the time. And in his Lamp of Memory, he writes, "Restoration means the most total destruction which a building can suffer." He goes on to offer options, more leaning towards preservation as opposed to restoration. And he says, "Bind it together with iron if it loosens, stay it with timbers where it declines. Do not care about the unsightliness of the aid, better a crutch than the loss of a limb. And do this tenderly and reverently and continually, and many a generation will still be born and pass away beneath its shadow." Luckily, conservators today have the advancement of science and technology to allow us to be a little bit more discreet in binding and staying our cultural heritage, though certainly the crutches definitely have their place. So one conservation definition that I really embrace in my practice is that by Cesare Brandi from the 1960s. In his theory of restoration, he says, "Conservation pertains especially to the material form in which the image is manifested. Every effort and all research should be directed at ensuring that the material form lasts as long as possible." And that is really sort of what I want to stress tonight, is how a conservator works towards the goal of material stability. We will take samples, do testing, investigations, exploration, to attempt to find the most gentle, compatible, and appropriate repair and material available to solve or repair or treat cultural heritage. Conservators also work towards another goal, and that is of authenticity. That's a very debatable theoretical topic, which I'm not covering tonight, but conservators can work to find physical evidence that contributes to this idea of authenticity and maybe original intent or a period of interpretation. Conservators are craftspeople. That's why it's particularly special to be at the General Society tonight. We have to take samples from buildings. We need to take as small as samples as possible that afford us the most information as possible. And we need to do that with very cautious, skilled hand techniques. And some of us, like myself, also implement treatment programs and restoration programs. And so again, we need to be very skilled and cautious in how we go about that. We also collaborate a great deal. We can see a project from beginning to end as the designers and the implementers, but more often we will collaborate with other conservators, preservation architects, engineers, specialists, other specialists, advanced analysis analysts, and so we can really work together in a team to try to have a holistic approach to cultural heritage. So somewhat obvious, what do we work on? We work on historic structures, monuments, sculpture. We work on the iconic, the significant, the district, the vernacular, and of course the deeply troubled. And we start always with documentation. Whether it's a small project or a very big involved one, we will always do documentation of our heritage. And there's several purposes to the documentation. One is to design our testing program, so we know when we approach the building, we get an idea of the materials, their conditions, and know from there what sorts of questions we might want to answer, and then can design a testing scope for the heritage. Documentation also helps in determining a condition's cause. So you might look at a building and see a couple isolated loss on the facade, areas of loss. you do your survey, you take your drawing back to your office, and without that sort of background noise of the visual of the building, you might see that there's this pattern of loss that goes up the facade, indicating that perhaps something greater is going on, in which case maybe there's movement or some sort of thermal reaction happening. And documentation can really sort of help highlight some of those things. Cost estimating is really beneficial for project management purposes, and documentation can really aid in that. So if we go to a building and we survey all the conditions, we can assume certain potential repairs for those conditions, and then we can put unit costs to those repairs, and then get an idea of that portion of a construction budget, for example, or a goal for fundraisers to try to reach. Documentation is really important for quality control of contractors. If you have a facade that's called out all of these repairs, the documentation will tell you where you need to go to make sure that it was done, and that it was done well. And documentation can also help in monitoring conditions. So there might maybe not be the budget to address some of the conditions currently, but you can document some of the conditions and then go back to them maybe several months, a year, years later, and monitor do a survey again and get an idea of the progression of that decay or not. And then, of course, for archival purposes, documentation is very important. Primarily for future generations to know what did the building look like in 2015 and what repairs were done to the building. So what do we document? We document materials, and that's not necessarily a unit by unit sort of survey. It might be, in this case, you have a primarily limestone building, but these sort of dark soiled units here are sandstone, and the treatment of sandstone might be very different than that of limestone, and in some cases actually very detrimental to limestone. So in this survey, for instance, you might want to call out each of the sandstone units. This building, from a distance, it's the Brooklyn Post Office. From a distance, it looks like granite, and it is in part granite. Then when you get closer to the building, you actually see that it is terracotta with a glaze that is made to look like granite. And so again, your survey might have granite on it and annotate where it begins and where it ends, and likewise for the terracotta. This building, from a distance, appears to be stone or maybe painted stone, but then you get up close to it, you actually see in the areas of failure on the window lintel, you see oxidized metal, and you can hold a magnet up to it or knock on it and find out it's cast iron. Other painted substrates, brick. Brick is pretty obvious whether it's painted or not. Usually all the brick and joints translate through the coatings. But the building on the left, it's somewhat hard to tell here, but in raking light, you have what are called these formwork marks, and that is an indication that underneath that paint is typically going to be a concrete-like product, poured in place concrete, or in this case, shotcrete. So we also document conditions. So I should just add that sort of all of these topics that I'm covering tonight can be semesters at university. So this is really a brief overview of some of the things we look at and consider. So this list of conditions is incredibly short. There are many, many conditions that conservators can confront. But I just shortlisted some of these to speak towards the goal of material stability that conservators try to work for. So this condition is dimensional loss, and dimensional loss doesn't necessarily need to be repaired. If the unit still is legible, if the monument still reads well, and the loss doesn't bring water back into the masonry system, you can actually leave the loss. It's fine not to repair it. However, when you get into situations like this with the dimensional loss exposing then the backup anchor, within the masonry, which is then oxidizing, that can lead to other more progressive problems within the facade, and these sorts of dimensional losses should be repaired. Another form of loss on terracotta, the glaze, the highly vitrified surface of the glaze on terracotta tiles can spall or fail, and that then exposes the terracotta clay body to the elements and can accelerate its decay. And similarly on the right, there's not a highly vitrified glaze. However, the terracotta has what it naturally gets in the kiln firing process, which is called a fire skin. And in this area here, where you see this orange sort of pebbled look, that fire skin is lost. We also have an exposed anchor, and now that clay body is also more susceptible to the elements. Other types of loss of finishes, whether it's in a highly decorative, significant paint scheme, or in a paint that is acting as a protective layer that is no longer protecting the substrate beneath it. Moisture can get into those failures and also really start to damage the substrate. Cracks are another condition that we address. They might seem like very small areas of water ingress. However, what we call capillary suction can be at play. So even very small cracks can really have a strong pull of water into the masonry system. So those need to be addressed. And on the right, we have what we call displacement. You can see the sort of the two units at the crack, the two separate pieces at the crack are somewhat unaligned. And then that's an indication to us that there's movement. Maybe it's active, maybe it's inactive, but we will work with an engineer to help determine that. So on a micro level of loss, we have scaling, which we can see in many different substrates. This one here is in concrete. And on the left, we have what we call disaggregation, and that's a granular loss of material typically found in marble. And it might seem insignificant on a very small scale, but it can be progressive and really end up in a considerable amount of loss for a historic structure. One area that keeps conservators very busy is previous repairs. They're typically, we come across ones that are very detrimental to historic fabric or are failing themselves. So the conservator needs to figure out, should we remove it? How do we remove it? And how then do we treat the historic fabric? And then, of course, the material instability that can happen from aggressive growth. These branches come off of the building about 5 feet, and they can be really destabilizing to a facade. And then we document repairs. And this will also maybe be in a survey format, and it will let us know which cracks were grout injected before being filled, which areas of loss were actually patched, and so that is something we will survey as well. So what do we document on? There's sort of two broad categories that we can pick from, and they can also be combined. It's drawings and photographs, and we can use original, historic, or current as-built, or current photography to document on. And we have to determine what the right approach is. There's several ways in which we can attempt to work with the client and answer that question. One might be size. It might be a small structure or a small monument or sculpture that you have total access around. So access is a question, size of the project is a question, budget, and of course maybe how many conditions there are. So on the right, this was a concrete sculpture that I'm working on that I could just walk up to and have all access to all sides. So I was just able to take photographs, slip those photographs, print them out, slip the photographs into sheet protectors, and take permanent markers and start to draw my conditions on them. And because I had such close access to the sculpture, I could then put all the quantities that I was finding, how many linear feet cracks were and how many square inches of patching and loss that there was. And this can also be done with drawings as well. These can be annotated in the field. And if you have historic drawings, you need to make sure that they do correspond to the structure as it is. And we can take those field drawings, the hand drawings, and photography and rectified photographs can be placed into CAD drawings, and then the conditions can be traced in AutoCAD. And that way you have an electronic, interactive condition survey with which to work. And that can be a really powerful tool for a preservation project. In some instances, I worked on the Second Bank of the United States at the University of Pennsylvania, and there was a condition happening on the blue Pennsylvania marble at the columns, and it was incipient spalling. So the spalls hadn't quite happened, but they were about to. You could hear it when you sounded it, and so we wanted to treat those. So a team went out and hand annotated the drawings of the columns. They were brought back to the computer lab. We scanned them, traced them in AutoCAD, but that wasn't quite enough information for us. We then took the AutoCAD layers and we imported them into ArcView. It's a geographic information systems-based software, and that allowed us to get quick quantities of all the conditions, but it also allowed us to try some predictive modeling, which is what we wanted to see with the Pennsylvania marble. If we have incipient spalls and we have these associated conditions or these associated geometries, is there some way we could figure out where other potential incipient spalls might occur? So once documentation is complete or ongoing, the testing phase really begins, and this is this can be done within a whole big scope of a conservator, or it can be a standalone item that maybe a preservation architect just requests the conservator to provide, and that's all the involvement we might have. The mortar is extremely important to a building. When you think of a building, you think it's limestone or it's brick. However, there is a lot of mortar there, and it plays an important role. The building on the left is exposed to what we call rising damp. So the masonry system is wicking up moisture at the foundation. It's going into the masonry wall, and it should be really breathing out the joints. But what's happening is these joints are too dense, so it's really breathing through the brick, and the brick then is spalling. And that is not a condition we want. It's much easier to repoint than to replace the brick. And similarly, on the right, the stone panels were exposed to movement, and again, we want really the mortar to take the brunt of that movement and fail, but the mortar in this case, again, too dense, too high strength, and we get cracking in the stone instead of the mortar. So this part of mortar analysis really, again, speaks to that idea of material stability and preservation. And it also has an aesthetic impact. Here's a photo I found online. It shows you bricks, all the same brick used in the facade, 3 different colored mortars, just to show you sort of that visual impact mortar can have. And on the right, we have a building in the arch. We have 3 original mortar joints, but it was later then repointed with this red pigmented cement mortar, which really does not present sort of an authentic building to the public. So then a conservator will take our tools and try to find original mortar. We'll use masonry hammers, chisels. On very fine joints, we'll use dental tools. Conservation somewhat starves for tools that are made just for us, so we usually borrow them from other industries. And we'll go out and we'll try to find original pointing mortar. Because there's been so much repointing in the many last decades, century, sometimes we can't find that original pointing mortar. We can go beyond the repointing mortar, and maybe they didn't cut back very far. We might be able to find mortar, repointing mortar just behind it. Sometimes we need to go even deeper, but then we're getting into bedding mortar, which has its limitations. If there was pigment in the mortar, that would not be in the bedding mortar. The sand grading might be different because of the different mechanical purpose it serves. So once we take our sample, we take it to the lab and we just visually characterize it with the unaided eye and with a microscope. And we note its color and grain shapes, grain sizes, and then we will break the mortar into smaller parts. And I'm hoping, maybe, oh yeah. And we will expose it to acid. And what this does is digest the binder, or dissolve the binder, the calcium-based binder. And I'll show you here, it's quite a dramatic reaction the calcium has to the hydrochloric acid. So what this is doing is dissolving the binder, and then we're left with our sands. And once this effervescence settles down, we rinse the sample and we filter it, and we are left with our isolated sands. On the left is a red sand under the microscope, and here's another sand in a beaker. And why we want the isolated sand is because it gives the color to the mortar, the sand does, but it also gives the mechanical properties. And I should note that this form of analysis also has its limitations because, of course, if you have calcitic-based sand, that's also going to go away in that acid bath. So a conservator needs to be aware of that. And what we'll do with the sands is sieve them through these standard sieves. And then it provides us an idea of the grading of the sand, of that historic sand. And what we can do is then compare the sand from our historic sample to commercially available sands, and we can sieve those as well, so we have an idea of how similar the grading is, and we compare the color and shape and size. And then we start our mixes, and this is where we start to play around with all the different proportions. On the left, it was a brownstone mortar that still, despite the red sand, still required some pigment. On the right, two sands were needed to be combined to match the color of the historic mortar. And then we just make a number of samples and keep comparing it to the historic sample and see what best provides a match. And this can be implemented then by the conservator or provided as a guide to contractors. Because there are these limitations in this form of analysis, petrography is available as well. This is typically used on more significant sites, but it gives you a much more clear understanding of binder and aggregate, pigment identification, and things like that. So another task that conservators will do, and again, this will be written into a scope that we're working on or might just be requested of us in an isolated manner, is paint analysis. This really sort of, again, talks to that idea of original intent. You can see here in the building, this was before paint analysis was done, and this was after, and it presents a very different image of the heritage to the public. So we also have to go sampling for paint samples. We'll, in this case, more use scalpels. In a lot of the masonry buildings we have in New York City, there are some painted elements, windows, doors, maybe canopies, balconies, but once you get into the interior, you can have an incredibly ornate architectural details that you need to sample, so you'll have to take many in this sort of situation, and you should always take more than one so that you can confirm what you retrieved is actually representative. We'll take those samples back to the lab, and we'll look at them under the microscope. If we need some clarity on the stratigraphy, we will embed them in resin, create a high polish on them, and we have a much clearer view of the stratigraphy of paint throughout the building's history. And this is, we do attempt to take the substrate so we sort of know which way is up on the sample. And so here you can see it's a cast iron substrate. So Sometimes we'll have conflicting information, maybe even from the same wall. 3 samples will show us 3 different colors, and then conservators will typically recommend exposures. And this is mechanical and chemical removals of paint layers to try to expose that layer in question. And in this case, you can see there was a decorative finish beneath the later layers, and here wood graining on a metal substrate. And similarly, if you want more exacting identification of binders and pigments, other analysis would be pursued, and that would could be something like infrared spectroscopy to give us a better sense of all the components of the paint. Conservators can do ion analysis, and this is really to understand salts that we're dealing with. Salts are incredibly deleterious to historic fabric, so we will sample those salts and we can take those to the lab, do microchemical spot tests. That really just gives us a positive or negative for a certain ion, or we can do strip tests that will give us semi-quantitative information, and that will help us understand better maybe where the salts are originating and how to remediate them. And again, other forms of advanced analyses are available, such as X-ray diffraction, so you get a better sense of what your salt compounds are. Another very short list of material analysis available. A conservator will know what test to pursue depending on what information we need to obtain, and we'll know what sort of sample to take for that test, who to give it to, and how to interpret their results. Just quickly, this is a photomicrograph from scanning electron microscopy, and this really shows you at high magnification the morphology of a sample. This is a historic stone with a consolidant treatment, and after curing and accelerated weathering, how it's performing on the sample. And this is an example of the spectra we might get from a coating sample. This one is for epoxy, so the analyst will have read the spectra from our historic sample, compare it to standards, and be able to give us an idea of what we're looking at or dealing with on heritage. So another big, broad sort of category of testing is for mechanical properties, and we can pursue these to get a better understanding of our historic materials, and also for repair materials to get a sense of how compatible they are with our historic materials. In the United States, we have the American Standard Test Methods to follow. They provide methodologies for us and calculations to determine results. They're great to use. They have their limitations also. A lot of times they want 15 3-inch cubes from a building, and we don't always have that luxury to take that much material off of our cultural heritage. So modifications can be made, or other tests might need to be pursued. This is, again, a very short list of some of those testing options. Basically, they are testing the material's reaction to some sort of external force, or to judge its, get an idea of its performance in relation to water, either water vapor or water immersion. Just a quick case study. I worked with Richbrook Conservation on Thomas Edison's garage. It's in New Jersey. The National Park Service wants to make this an exhibit space, and they wanted to know what the original layer was, what it looked like, and how we can mimic it to put it over the existing coatings. What a coating manufacturer will really say is strip all your coatings and put on our coating. Well, again, we don't have that luxury in preservation, which is what makes it so exciting and challenging, because it's a new puzzle every time. So we have 3 basic substrates that are exposed in this interior: bare concrete, some later lime washes, and some mid-1900s synthetics. Synthetics are a bond breaker, so we were concerned about adhesion of a coating, particularly to that synthetic layer. So we did a lot of research, narrowed it down to 4 products. It was a cement coating, a cementitious coating that was original to the structure. I should say that the reason the garage is significant is all his electric cars are there and his charging station that he designed, and so they are wanting to open that to the public. So we just selected the 4 products that we narrowed it down to. We created test areas on the 3 substrates that were primarily exposed. We were allowed to remove unsound coating, so some preparation was allowed. We set up our test areas and we worked with a decorative finisher to apply each of these coatings on each of our test areas. And once those cured, I came in with the adhesion tester, and so you epoxy these metal dollies onto the test areas, and you attach the unit, the actuator, to the dolly, and then the machine applies a constant pressure, a pulling pressure, to that dolly until it fails. And what you end up with is being able to see the plane of failure and the PSI at which the coating failed. And this was one criteria we used in order to recommend a coating that the National Park Service could use. Another quick case study, it was for repair mortars, hardened cured repair mortars for the Ayyubid Wall in Cairo. This was some thesis work of mine. We had 3 mixes that we were working with, and I had to make a number of samples for all the different mechanical testing that we were doing. So in the upper left-hand corner, I made prisms for 3-point bending, cubes for some water tests and compression testing, and you just use sort of a souped-up version of your KitchenAid mixer and made many, many samples, cured them in proper curing chambers, and then subjected them to these tests. The 3 mixes, the graph really shows you sort of this dramatic difference between cement and lime. So these high peaks in the middle represent the cement mixes, and the ones on the sides represent the lime, the hydraulic lime and a lime putty. And this curve was similar. This is a compression strength graph, and the curve was similar, though not quite as dramatic for the 3-point bending. Inversely, we have the water vapor transmission rate test, in which I made a number of discs, and the discs were put in these assemblies in which they had water at the bottom of them, and they were weighed continuously. So the water vapor was working its way through the sample, and then we had an idea of permeability or breathability of the mixes. And again, inverse to the compression graph, we see how much less permeable or breathable the cement mortars are compared to the lime ones. So some water tests that we can do. Water absorption by immersion is one that gives us an idea of % absorption. And again, you want your repair material to be more absorptive than your historic material. These sorts of water baths can be used to thaw your materials, and then you take them out, you put them in a freezer, you take them out, thaw them in the water, and you just keep doing that cycle, so you have this accelerated weathering effect on your repair mortars or historic mortar samples or any historic samples. Or you can make these baths salt solutions, and these are repair mortars after coming out of a salt bath, which was quite dramatic. And we can also do sort of quick and dirty lab and field trials, and these can be very simple, very easy to execute, but actually be incredibly informative. On the upper left-hand corner, this was marble that we needed a water repellency quality to it, so we applied water repellent coatings to the marble, left one area untreated, and then just did a quick water drop test to see if the water beaded, to let us know if the coating was effective, and also to judge by the unaided eye if there was any sort of discoloration or aesthetic impact from this coating as well. And in the lower corner, I am working on a project that is a concrete sculpture. It's fine art sculpture. A consultant prior to me had recommended the use of injecting epoxy into some of the hairline cracks, but I was a little worried. Again, it sort of has that similar performance of cement, very dense, very hard, very strong, very hard. So I wanted to explore some other options for the client. So I just grabbed some cracked CMU units, drilled some port holes in them, and then was able to inject those portholes with a variety of products. I tried the epoxy that was recommended. I tried filling that epoxy to bulk it up a little so maybe it wouldn't go all over the surface. I tried cementitious grouts, acrylics, and was able just to give the client a really good idea with a very simple test that the epoxy was indeed hard to control and did mar the surface, and I was able to find a better product to recommend. Testing cleaning is something else conservators are requested to do. Again, this is something we might work into a scope or will just be asked to do on its own. This speaks more to the idea of authenticity or original intent. There's not always a need to remove soiling. It's not necessarily detrimental to material stability, but we have an array of chemical cleaners we can try. These can be ones we make in our lab. There's great restoration, preservation products off the shelf that we can use. And of course, water falls in this category as well. And something a conservator needs to do is always test water before any chemicals in that spirit of trying to find the most gentle, appropriate, and compatible material and method to treat historic structures. And then there's waterless cleaning options, especially for interiors. These can be really great. They can be dry sponges, erasers, or in this case, latexes, where you brush on the latex, it dries, and you peel it much like you would a facial peel, and it takes all the soiling and impurity off the masonry surface. And then we have a number of mechanical cleaning options available to us. There's a number of systems out there, a lot of different media, and a conservator can work with an operator to determine what the best media is, or always start with the most gentle and work towards the more aggressive. You can work with them on PSI, so the strength of the delivery of that media, the distance from the heritage. So a conservator will work with an operator to see what the most gentle approach is. We'll usually be out there with our loop, which is like a jeweler's magnifying glass. It's like a 10x magnification, so we can look at the surface in magnification to know if any damage is occurring on the surface of the stone. And I had the privilege of going to a tour of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is under conservation right now. So it's actually being implemented, but it was a neat opportunity to take a video that I hope to show you here. So he's using one of these microabrasive systems, and this is, again, implementation, and actually it looks like he's spray painting the building white, which he's not doing. He's cleaning it. So you can see how he's cleaning off the soiled marble. This is a conservator on the project from Building Conservation Associates, showing everyone how gentle actually the microabrasive is. I can stick my hand in front of it, so it's, you know, it can't be doing damage to the building. And this was a tour given by Deer Path Construction, which was... So design development, if we sort of think in architectural phases, a lot of our work will happen in the schematic design phase. Once we get to the design development and CDs, conservators can help implement mock-ups, work with contractors to implement mock-ups, so a client can get a better sense of what they're going to get as an end result. We'll make recommendations of repairs and treatments, work plans, and we can also write the conservation-related specifications for a project. And during construction phase, again, a conservator can be the implementer. And this is what I'm implementing, some crack fills there on a sculpture. We can be involved in quality control with contractors. Again, this can be a really great relationship that develops over time on a project. The conservator can really give the contractor a sort of appreciation for the historic materials they're working with. I've had the occasion to give a contractor my loop and have him look at the stone underneath the loop and have that sort of wow moment of look at all the shells that are embedded in that limestone. And so it's just a really nice appreciation a contractor can develop for the material he's working on. And likewise, the contractor can give conservators great tips and tricks of the trade to know that we can really work together then and give the client a really good product. And then, of course, we can do some construction administration services as well. And last but not least, maintenance. Conservators can play a role in this as well. We can develop a maintenance plan. We can implement that maintenance plan. Maybe it's a yearly cleaning or a yearly monitoring of conditions. And then, of course, for sites that have a lot of cultural heritage on them, for example, like a cemetery, we can help train crews to do better maintenance procedures. Instead of maybe pointing with cement mortars, we can train them to use lime mortars. We can train them to use low pressure washers as opposed to sandblasters. And so that can really serve our cultural heritage well. And I'll leave you with this quote from John Ruskin: "Take proper care of your monuments and you will not need to restore them." Thank you. Questions, I guess? Yeah.
And thank you, Amanda. With respect to Thomas Edison's garage, had there been any attempts to restore it? And if not, what took so long?
You know, actually, I don't know that side of the project. There have not been any attempts to restore it, though clearly there have been painting campaigns going on. But no, it's actually sort of awful. There's all these coatings failing all over on top of all these amazing electric cars. So yeah, it's about time.
Have you ever come across a structure that is really beyond repair and preservation? And if so, how do you determine that it's beyond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I'm sort of the ilk of there is no structure beyond repair. But of course, that might depend on its use. I have not, in my experience, come across a structure that has been beyond repair. I've been asked to please say that it is beyond repair. However, again, that depends on how much time and effort and money can be put into it. And of course, then there is that crossover between conservation and restoration, where certainly there can be maybe a lot of restoration involved, and you can still make that structure a functioning structure.
In that video you showed us with the worker doing the water washing.
Yeah.
Shouldn't you be taping over the mortar joints before you actually, wash them with water to avoid like penetration?
Because of water infiltration?
Yes.
As far as I know, and I was just part of this tour with Deer Path Construction, but as far as I know, the repointing campaign was done. So in theory, the mortar joints are sound. They are still breathable, but it's actually it wasn't a water system, but a microabrasive system. So it's actually more media than water that is coming out of that system. So it doesn't introduce a lot of moisture into the wall, though that is definitely a consideration that needs to be thought about before implementation. And many times that's what makes it not an option.
Is that better? I lived in an 1850s federal-style brick house in Brooklyn, and it had been painted and lined to imitate the mortar joints, and I was told that was because the bricks were very soft and porous, and that's what they did going that far back. And so we had it stripped and then coated with a silicone repellent, which, you know, still today the bricks look like they're brand new. Do you know is there a lifetime to that sort of a treatment? I think that was done in 1975 or so, and as I say, it seems fine. We don't have water incursion. Is there a time span by which I should be looking for another such treatment?
Right. I don't know. So many products will recommend different lifespans, and of course that depends on some of maybe the microclimate they're in, wind or some sort of abrasion or rain. But it's good to hear it's working so well. Sometimes silicone can be very unbreathable, so that might be one of those products that conservators might shy away from sometimes, so that's great to hear that it's worked for so long. But typically, coatings will be 15 years, or even many of them will come across, say, 10 years and reapply. So it sounds like you've gotten a really good life out of this one.
I'm wondering, has acid rain and contemporary pollutants changed the whole balance of conservation in unpredictable ways that are still unknowns and variables that are?
Well, we do know that acid rain certainly has its effect on particularly calcitic stones, so limestones, marbles, some concretes. So much like that acid bath that I showed you, that's on some level what's happening to some of our heritage with acid rain. So it is an issue. There's been nothing that dramatic of late, but yes, the acid rain certainly has an effect on those calcite-based. Well, there are ways to treat the building with what's called consolidants. They can help create sort of bridges between all the grains and strengthen them and make them more acid resistant. So there are treatments, and conservators, again, will maybe test them in small areas to make sure that we actually stop getting sort of all that granular loss. So in that one picture I showed where that sculpture was really disaggregating, that can be treated with a consolidant, likely treated with a consolidant to really sort of cement those grains in place and provide more acid resistance. Thanks. Oh, sorry.
I'll give you a chance to receive an applause for a second time. Have you seen from your conservation work with different period buildings, whether building techniques have become like less ingenious or less, you know, how shall I say, less durable? Yes. And I have an example of that. Actually, recently I heard a comment. There was a restoration of a church because of water damage. It was like, I think, a late 19th century church. And the bishop said, can you imagine, he compared to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and he says that building has not had any water problem for like so many centuries, millennia. And that's really what inspired me to ask the question about construction techniques.
Right. You know, I haven't seen anything that's a suggestion of time, meaning materials have gotten worse more recently. I find that within all sorts of historic structures, you'll have some better built than others. I mean, I worked on the Guggenheim Museum, and that was a water disaster, so maybe there is something about the more recent the building is, the less it performs. But you will find poor bricks used long ago, as well as really high-quality bricks. So I haven't necessarily seen any sort of progressive decline in performance in building materials.
So, Amanda, before you depart, I just want to thank you so much. That was so informative, so comprehensive, and so detailed, and your eloquence in explaining some of these quite technical things. So really, another round of applause, because I think that was terrific. So thank you. Yes. It is our great pleasure to have you here this evening, and to make a presentation, our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
Yes, and Amanda, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, thank you so much for your participation in our Labor, Literature, and Landmarks lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. It's been a total honor. Thank you. Thanks.
And as a little memento, this is Meg Stanton, our program assistant.
Hello. Thank you.
Right. Right, yes.
Not to see that picture
Right,
anymore.
yeah.
And then on the back, of course, we want to be seeing more of you, Amanda, so there's your library membership.
Right, right, right. Thank you. So I would like to thank you all so much for coming this evening, to thank Amanda again, to remind you that we have a wine and cheese now, and I'm sure Amanda will be happy to answer some other questions. I also just want to remind you about the upcoming lectures. In addition, for those of you who were at the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that we're going to be celebrating the New York Landmarks Conservancy here on April 21st with Peg Breen. And then on May 20th, we're going to have Anne Walker from Peter Pinoy Architects, who will be discussing New York Transformed, the Architecture of Cross and Cross. And we have, as part of our Artisan lecture series, and I think it's a lecture that will dovetail beautifully with this, on April 14th, we will have Jeff Green from Evergreen Architectural Arts. So I hope you will come to that as well. Thank you so much again for coming this evening.
Yes. And just, I want to acknowledge Lisa Easton, you know, this conservation, the science of all of this. We recently had a historic structures report with the assistance of the National Endowment for the Arts and the New York State Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And Easton Architects was able to come up with 700 pages, and it is a page turner, of information on this building in every detail, and it was one of the most enjoyable experiences one could have in terms of learning about this historic structure, this building built in 1891, and the addition built in 1903. So, Lisa, thank you.